At exactly 6 o'clock every morning, a quiet man named Michael Carter entered St. Vincent's Medical Center through the back entrance, wearing a faded gray janitor's uniform, carrying a mop bucket in one hand and a small lunch bag in the other. Nobody paid much attention to him. To the doctors rushing toward the emergency department, he was invisible. To the nurses preparing for another exhausting shift, he was simply the janitor. To wealthy patients and their families, he was someone who cleaned the floors they walked across. Michael never complained about being ignored. He kept his head down, did his work carefully, and greeted everyone with the same gentle smile. He was 42 years old, tall, calm, and surprisingly well educated for someone working in a hospital maintenance department. What nobody knew was that Michael Carter had once been one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in the country. Years earlier, he had performed complicated heart surgeries that other doctors considered impossible, had published groundbreaking research, and had received international awards for his work. But after the sudden death of his younger brother, Michael had walked away from medicine and disappeared from the public eye. His brother Daniel had been his best friend, and Michael had promised him that he would always protect Daniel's daughter, Emma. When Daniel died unexpectedly, Michael became responsible for Emma, who was only 9 years old. He sold almost everything he owned, created a trust for her future, and moved to a quieter city where nobody knew his name. He took the janitor position at St. Vincent's because it gave him flexible hours and allowed him to remain close to the hospital in case Emma ever needed him. He had no desire to return to the operating room. He believed his life as a surgeon was over. But fate had other plans. One Monday morning, while Michael was cleaning the corridor outside the cardiology department, a group of young doctors walked past him laughing. Dr. Richard Blake, the hospital's chief resident, stopped beside Michael and looked at the wet floor. "You missed a spot," Richard said arrogantly. Michael looked down. "I'll clean it again." Richard smirked. "Of course you will. That's what you're paid for." The other doctors laughed. Michael said nothing. Richard continued, "You know, I sometimes wonder if people like you ever wanted more from life." Michael quietly replied, "Everyone wants more from life." Richard laughed. "Then maybe you should have studied harder." The words were cruel, but Michael simply returned to his work. He had heard worse. What Richard didn't know was that Michael had graduated at the top of his medical school class, completed one of the most competitive surgical fellowships in the country, and had once been Richard's own attending physician during a conference years earlier. But Michael had changed so much since then that Richard didn't recognize him. Over the next few weeks, the mockery became routine. Some nurses called him "Professor" sarcastically because they noticed he always read medical journals during his lunch break. One young doctor asked him whether he could even understand the complicated medical terminology he was reading. Michael smiled and said, "A little." They laughed. But one nurse named Sarah noticed something different about him. She had worked at St. Vincent's for 12 years and quickly realized that Michael wasn't an ordinary janitor. He knew the names of medications, understood medical abbreviations, and sometimes noticed mistakes before the doctors did. One afternoon, she found him staring at an X-ray displayed on a computer screen in an empty consultation room. "Do you understand that?" she asked. Michael immediately stepped away. "I was just looking." Sarah smiled. "You were looking like a surgeon." Michael hesitated. "I used to be one." Sarah stared at him. "You're serious?" Michael nodded. "A long time ago." Before she could ask another question, an emergency alarm suddenly sounded throughout the hospital. A young woman had collapsed in the lobby. She was 26 weeks pregnant and suffering from severe breathing difficulties. Nurses rushed to her, followed by several doctors. Michael was cleaning nearby when he heard someone say, "Her blood pressure is dropping." He looked toward the emergency team and immediately recognized the symptoms. The woman wasn't simply having a panic attack. Something much more dangerous was happening. Michael watched for several seconds before stepping closer. "You need to check for aortic dissection," he said quietly. Richard Blake turned around angrily. "Stay out of this." Michael pointed toward the patient. "Her pulse is different in each arm." Richard looked again. The nurses checked and discovered that Michael was right. The room became tense. "Get a CT scan," Richard ordered. But Michael shook his head. "She's pregnant and unstable. You don't have time." Richard snapped, "You're a janitor. Stop giving medical advice." Michael looked at the patient and then at the terrified husband standing nearby. "If you wait for the scan, she may not survive." The chief surgeon, Dr. Evelyn Moore, finally arrived. "What's happening?" Richard quickly explained that the janitor was interfering with the emergency team. Evelyn looked at Michael. "What did you see?" Michael calmly described the patient's symptoms and explained exactly what he suspected. Evelyn checked the patient's pulse and immediately became serious. "He's right." Richard stared at her. "What?" Evelyn turned toward the surgical team. "Prepare the operating room immediately." Within minutes, the hospital was in chaos. The woman was rushed toward surgery. Michael stepped aside, but Evelyn stopped him. "How did you know?" she asked. Michael simply replied, "I've seen it before." "Where?" "In an operating room." Evelyn looked at him carefully. "Who are you?" Michael didn't answer. The surgery was successful. Both the mother and baby survived. The story spread throughout the hospital by the end of the day. People started whispering about the janitor who had diagnosed a life-threatening condition before the doctors. Richard was furious. He convinced himself that Michael had simply guessed. But the following morning, another incident changed everything. A 12-year-old boy named Noah was admitted with severe chest pain. His parents had been told that it was probably anxiety, but Michael noticed the boy while cleaning the pediatric wing. Noah's breathing pattern immediately caught his attention. Michael stopped and watched him for several seconds. Then he approached the nurse. "Has anyone checked for a congenital coronary anomaly?" The nurse frowned. "The pediatric cardiologist is already evaluating him." Michael nodded, but something bothered him. "Please don't ignore it." Later that afternoon, Noah collapsed. The doctors rushed him into the emergency room. Tests revealed a rare heart condition that required immediate surgery. The pediatric cardiologist was unavailable, and the hospital's surgical team was preparing to transfer Noah to another facility. Michael heard the conversation and quietly said, "I can help." Richard, who was nearby, laughed. "You?" Michael looked at him calmly. "Yes." Richard shook his head. "You're a janitor." Michael didn't respond. Instead, Dr. Evelyn Moore looked directly at him. "You said you were a surgeon." "I was." "What kind?" Michael hesitated. "Cardiothoracic." Evelyn stared at him. "What's your full name?" Michael finally answered, "Dr. Michael Alexander Carter." The room went silent. Evelyn's eyes widened. "Michael Carter?" Richard frowned. Why does that name sound familiar? One of the older nurses suddenly covered her mouth. Oh my God! She hurried to a computer and searched his name. Within seconds, an old photograph appeared on the screen. Michael Carter, internationally renowned heart surgeon, recipient of the National Medical Excellence Award, former director of cardiac surgery at one of the country's leading hospitals. The same face stared back at them, only younger. Richard's expression completely changed. That's impossible. Michael quietly said, "It isn't." The entire hospital seemed to freeze. Doctors gathered around the computer. Nurses whispered. Someone found an old medical documentary featuring Michael performing a complicated heart transplant. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You were that Dr. Carter?" Michael nodded. "I was." Richard suddenly remembered something. Years earlier, during medical school, he had attended one of Michael's lectures. He had written down every word because Michael had been his inspiration for becoming a surgeon. Richard looked horrified. "I mocked you." Michael said nothing. Richard swallowed hard. "I called you a janitor." Michael gently replied, "That's what I was doing." "But you're a legendary surgeon." Michael shook his head. "I was a surgeon. That doesn't make me better than anyone." Then the hospital director arrived after hearing the news. He stared at Michael as though he had seen a ghost. "Dr. Carter, why didn't you tell us who you were?" Michael looked toward the operating room where Noah was fighting for his life. "Because I didn't come here to be recognized." The director asked, "Then why did you come?" Michael took a deep breath. "I needed a job. I needed to take care of my niece. And I wanted a quiet life. But Noah still needed surgery." Michael reviewed the boy's scans and identified a surgical approach that could save him without transferring him. The hospital director hesitated, but Evelyn trusted him. "Let him operate," she said. Michael entered the operating room for the first time in 7 years. His hands were steady, but his heart was racing. The familiar lights above him brought back memories he had tried to bury. He remembered his brother Daniel, his last surgery, the phone call that changed his life, and the reason he had walked away. But when he looked at Noah, he remembered why he had become a surgeon in the first place. The operation lasted nearly 6 hours. Everyone waited anxiously. Finally, Michael walked out. "He's alive," he said. Noah's mother collapsed into tears of gratitude. The hospital erupted in applause. Richard stood at the back of the corridor, ashamed. He approached Michael later that evening. "Dr. Carter." Michael turned. Richard looked down. "I owe you an apology." Michael nodded. "Yes, you do." Richard swallowed. "I judged you because of your uniform. I thought being a janitor made you less intelligent, less important, less worthy of respect." Michael looked at him for a moment. "And what did you learn?" Richard answered, "That I was measuring a person by their job instead of their character." Michael smiled slightly. "Then the apology means something." Richard asked, "Will you come back to surgery?" Michael looked through the hospital window at the city lights. "I don't know." But he did know one thing: he wasn't ready to waste the skills he had spent his life developing. A week later, the hospital offered him the position of director of cardiac surgery. Michael accepted, but with one condition. He asked the hospital to increase salaries and training opportunities for maintenance workers, nurses, orderlies, and other support staff. "A hospital isn't held together by doctors alone," he said. "Every person matters." The director agreed. Michael continued treating everyone with the same respect he had always wanted for himself. He still greeted the janitors every morning. He still ate lunch with the nurses. He never allowed anyone to call him superior. And whenever a new doctor mocked a cleaner or spoke disrespectfully to a cafeteria worker, Michael immediately stopped them. "You may save someone's life with your hands," he would say, "but you can destroy someone's dignity with your words." Months later, St. Vincent's held a ceremony honoring Michael for his return to medicine. Hundreds of employees gathered in the auditorium. Richard was asked to introduce him. He stood at the podium and said, "I once thought this man was just a janitor. I was wrong. He was a brilliant surgeon hiding behind a uniform, but more importantly, he was a good man hiding behind humility." The audience applauded. Michael walked onto the stage wearing a white doctor's coat. But underneath it, he still wore the small hospital maintenance badge he had kept from his janitor days. He looked at the audience and smiled. "I didn't wear that uniform because I was ashamed," he said. "I wore it because honest work is never beneath anyone." The applause grew louder. Michael looked toward the back of the room where Sarah and the maintenance workers were standing. "The greatest lesson I learned here was not about medicine. It was about people. You never know the story of the person standing beside you. The man cleaning your floor might have once saved 100 lives. The woman serving your food might be raising 3 children alone. The person you ignore today might be the person who saves you tomorrow." The entire hospital stood and applauded. Richard wiped away a tear. Sarah smiled proudly. And Michael realized that perhaps fate had not brought him to St. Vincent's to hide from his past. Perhaps it had brought him there so he could finally understand why he had become a doctor in the first place. From that day forward, nobody at St. Vincent's ever called Michael, just the janitor, again. But Michael never forgot those years when they did. He kept his old gray uniform hanging inside his office as a reminder that respect should never depend on a title, a salary, or a white coat. Years later, when someone asked him what his proudest achievement as a surgeon had been, Michael didn't mention the awards, the difficult surgeries, or the millions of dollars his research had generated. He simply smiled and said, "It was the day everyone finally learned that every person deserves to be seen." And in the hospital where they had once mocked him, the man they thought was only a janitor became the doctor everyone trusted, the mentor everyone respected, and the living proof that sometimes the person you look down on may be carrying a story powerful enough to change your entire world.